Okay, so modern technology with language learning at our fingertips at a moment's notice. And there are so many different tools and methods that we can use to study language. So I've been trying many different methods to study Chinese, and I've also started Hindi very recently. And I wanted to share things that I feel have been working for me. So starting with whatever language you want to learn, I think understanding some basics about the pronunciation can be really useful. So in Chinese, we use pinyin, which is the English version of the characters. So if you can read that, you understand to some extent the pronunciation of the words. So if you're learning through a text-based approach and you don't have your earphones or for whatever reason you can't listen, at least you can still gauge what some of the words are. And I think that's really useful. Now languages like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Hindi, Tamil, Arabic, they'll have different scripts. So if you are unable to read those, or you're not willing to learn just yet, or it might take a long time to learn, such as the case with Chinese or Japanese, then you'll be wanting to get quite familiar with the Romanized, the English version of those pronunciations so you can read the words. Another thing that I think is really good before starting out is figuring out, are there some generic baselines that you can follow and have a level to? So in languages you might hear the term C1, A1, B1, B2. But some languages might have their own exam curriculum. So for example, in Chinese, they have the HSK exams, HSK 1, 2, and so on. And that can be quite useful because as you jump around between different apps or resources, or you get teachers, you can say, I'm around this level. So having some way to gauge yourself can also be quite useful as you progress on the language journey. Now, one of the first methods I want to go over, beside going over the basics, is finding a teacher. Now these methods aren't in any order, I'm just going through different ones that I'm currently using. So I like to use Preply, italki is another place you can find them personally online, or you know them, or friend of a friend, whichever way you have a tutor. I like Preply because it's online, I can schedule it very easily, I can move around, message the teachers, they can message me, send each other messages. It's a very easy platform to use, but whichever one works for you. The main point that I'm making here is having a teacher who can help you, can correct you. You can even get someone who's just a native speaker, but because you pay them for that whole hour, they're giving you their time. And I think that distinction also is important, that there is a difference in a teacher and a native speaker. Someone who's just a native speaker may communicate with you, but a teacher will actually know how to teach language, or they have different methods and approaches. On that note, you might have different debates or discussions or disputes on what's an effective learning method and what's not. I don't know what the best way is, but for example, some people like comprehensible input, where they can understand 90% of what's being said to them, but 10% they can't understand and they're slowly building it up. Whereas other teachers might give you hard grammar instructions to go over. So there are different ways that teachers will like to work, and what works for you and how the teacher wants to work, you will need to filter for it and figure out. Then the next method that I find to be very powerful, especially in the beginning, are progressive audio courses. That means it's an audio course, so it's hands-free, and ideally it's progressive, meaning from each lesson to lesson, they're getting more challenging and more challenging based on the foundation you built from the previous lesson. The best example that I can think of is Pimsleur. There are other ones such as Rocket Language, or you can find maybe Coffee Break, the podcast series, or there'll be podcasts in your specific languages. And then what's great about these is that you're practicing listening, you're practicing speaking, and you're building up your vocabulary in the target language step by step. What I love about it, as someone who thrives a lot or commutes a lot, is that as long as you can listen to audio, you can do these classes. So at any point that you can listen, and ideally speak, because you want to speak out loud as well, every single commute that I have, I'm progressing in my language of choice, assuming I have the content available. So I'm a very big fan of progressive audio courses. And for me personally, when I learn a new language, it's the way I start out. For example, if I go to a teacher and I've already done some hours on one of these courses like Pimsleur, then I can already have some basic phrases, conversation, I can express things, I can pick up words in different TV shows. And although I'm not actively studying the languages now at the time of this video, I did quite a few hours in Japanese and Korean. And when I was in those two respective countries, I was only using Japanese and Korean exclusively to get around, ask for directions, order food. Couldn't have a deep conversation, mind you. But that in itself added so much enjoyment to traveling around in those countries. The next will be learning new vocabulary. And I like to use a few ways, but what I'm specifically focusing on in this section of the video are vocabulary apps. So Duolingo is the most popular one. Your language of choice might have your own specific apps. For example, Chinese have Super Mandarin or HelloChinese. There's some new ones like Airline, there's Drops, Lingodeer I really like, and I actually think Lingodeer is probably one of the best ones for a reason I'll get to later. So these are very good because they gamify language learning. They make sure you have a minimum 2 to 5, 10 minutes a day of study, even if you do nothing else. And you're always ensuring that you're getting new vocabulary because the lessons will progress over time. What they do really well at doing is making sure that you have that daily minimum. which is what I was trying to get at earlier. But I think they can cause an issue is if you get too much into, say, a gamified system, you want to be top of the league on Duolingo. Let's say you only got a certain amount of time per day for studying your language. You might give too much of your day to Duolingo when there could have been more useful methods that you could have done in that same time. So that's the only caveat I would give. Now, some of these apps provide means of flashcards, ideally using a spaced repetition system, where you're going through the lessons, you're going through the course, but there should be a separate section of the app where you can go over things you've learned previously. Some of them do it better than others. I think, in my experience, Lingodeer is really good at it. I've not really seen this feature in Duolingo. Maybe it exists. If someone knows, you can let me know. And what I like about this is you can learn as many new words as you want, but if you don't have a means of keeping them in your long-term memory, it's a bit useless because you're just constantly learning new aspects. So you need to make sure you're building up on that long-term memory by using the features in the app to go over grammar points or sentences or words that you've learned in the past. I'll cover this a bit more in the flashcard section of the video, but I would say it's better if they can give it to you in sentence examples rather than just individual words. And then on that note, going onto the flashcard system, I think is one of the biggest aspects for me that I found to be really impactful is having a sophisticated way of keeping things in your long-term memory. Anki is the app that I like to use. This is a flashcard program that you can either make your own cards in, so you make your own flashcards into, there's loads of tutorials on YouTube on how to do this. You can also download a pre-made deck. Now this, there are two ways. You can download a deck where you already know the content of that deck. So for example, if I finish the Pimsleur Chinese course, I can download the Pimsleur Anki deck, and then all the flashcards are coming from Pimsleur, which I've already gone through and learned. Or you can download a deck that someone's made and you're actually learning new words through Anki. So as the flashcards come up, that's your first time coming across it and you're learning it. Some people have different views on this, so you see what works best for you. I do a mixture of all three. I will use Anki to download decks of courses I've already done. I will use Anki to download and learn new phrases, and I also use Anki just on my own day-to-day. If I find a new phrase, I want to add it to my long-term memory, I might, and I can't, and let's say the place I learned it from doesn't have its own inbuilt long-term memory function. So for example, if I learn a new phrase from Lingodeer, I know Lingodeer has its own spaced repetition flashcard system, so I'm not too worried. But if I learn a phrase from another app that maybe I don't have the premium version of, or they don't have inbuilt spaced repetition, or I learned it from a TV show, I picked up the subtitle, then I might add it to, or in a conversation with a teacher, then I'll add it to my Anki deck as well and have it in there. And there are loads of videos and tutorials on Anki. Now, when I say spaced repetition, this means that the words, there's a formula behind how often the words or sentences will come back to you in the app just before you're about to forget it. So when you see the phrase, you can write down if you remember, you can click if you remembered it or forgot it, how easy, difficult it was. And based on this, there'll be a formula on how often that will re-show. Definitely recommend looking into videos on Anki because this video won't cover the whole details of that. The next will be comprehensible input. This means you're watching content or you're engaging with content, maybe reading content, where you understand the bulk of it, let's say 90% plus. And then the rest of the 10%, you're going to acquire new content from the body language, from the context. Some way you're going to acquire what's missing. And there are loads of playlists online of comprehensible input in your target language. You can just type on YouTube, you can go on Google. There are whole systems designed to give you comprehensible input and how many hours you're in, that's how challenging the content will be. Some languages have more resources on this than others, but this is something that I want to do a lot more on. I've already done it very briefly and I noticed how useful it was, especially with my listening comprehension. And then also when I pick up a word like this, sometimes it really stays in my long-term memory without even needing flashcards because it's almost like I feel like I'm feeling the word much more. The next is speaking with native speakers. We already covered this a bit with the teachers, but even if you have friends, partners, language meetup exchanges where you might give them English, they give you Chinese, or you exchange some skill, anywhere where there are even apps, HelloTalk or Tandem, where you can find people who are speaking the language that you want to learn. There are many different ways, meetup.com, as I said, language exchanges. Any chance you have, and also the other person needs to be willing to do it. Sometimes people, especially when you're in the early stages and you can't speak much, some people might not be that keen, which is why I mentioned the teacher as well, because then they're paid to listen to you, or you can even pay for a native speaker. They're not a fully qualified teacher, but they can just talk to you. I think having some sort of conversation, output, input, they're correcting you, correcting them. Now, some people have different methods on how to do this. Some people say you shouldn't be corrected, just express yourself. Grammar can be done separately, naturally. Some people prefer it to have it more of a hardcore, okay, correct me on everything. I don't know what the hard rule or science is on this yet, but whichever way it is, I found speaking to native speakers to be really useful. Another caveat to this is sometimes speaking to other people who are also learning your language, because you both are really keen to practice. And especially if you're both at a decent level, I found this to be quite effective. I've been fortunate, I met a few people that have very good Chinese, but Chinese is their second language, and I found it to be really enjoyable to speak to them in Chinese. Next will be AI. So I think AI can be really useful. I ask it to help me build my flashcards, and I ask it to explain grammar points. Sometimes the translations might not be completely accurate though, so just watch out. Especially if you get more sophisticated, for example, Notebook LM, you can chuck loads of files in, you can make little podcasts, or you can even speak to AI. If you've got GPT, you can talk to it and ask it to speak in the language. There are many different ways you can use AI. The next I want to talk about is learning characters or an alphabet of a different language. Now, if you have a language like Korean or Hindi, you're actually learning an alphabet, so it's not as challenging as learning Japanese or Chinese, where you have characters, where different words will have a different character. And I found that regardless of which one you're doing, the best way that I found to do it is to have mnemonics, where every character or every letter in the said alphabet will have some sort of story that you can use to help you memorize it. You also just have rote memorization, where you're just writing it again and again and again. But I found where if you can get a good app or a good video where there are mnemonics, so a little story that goes for each character, and that can be really useful. I've been using Hanli Chinese Decoded for Chinese characters, and it's been game-changing. I was so intimidated by learning how to read, but now I can read simple stories on apps like Do Chinese, and graded readers are apps or books where the level of content you're about to read, so you can say beginner, intermediate, advanced, and so on. Now, in terms of actually writing, so for Chinese, I've decided not to write for now. As long as I can recognize the characters, that's enough for me. It depends on you whether you want to learn that. Maybe on a language like Hindi or Korean, you don't need to memorize as much, so writing might be a bit easier. But for Chinese, it will add so much time to add learning how to write in the correct stroke order that with the time I have for learning Chinese, I've decided to leave that for now. Especially because most people will type with their keyboard using the romanized pinyin, and then the characters pop up. But if you want to learn that, there are apps and tools and methods for that as well. And then my final thought is that although I'm not fluent in any languages I'm learning, I can have a good conversation, I can communicate to varying degrees, and it adds a level of connection, adds friendships or experiences that I wouldn't have had otherwise, helps you engage with the respective content. It's great brain training. And instead of, say, doom scrolling, I can just do a language app, I can do flashcards. Anywhere I am on the go, I can study language, and I find that to be really empowering. So curious to know if there's any methods I'm missing, if any methods you think are more powerful than others. Maybe it depends on what stage of the journey you're on, but I really hope you add language learning, even if it's not to become fluent, but just to express yourself, because it's so fun and you can incorporate it into your daily life quite easily now. Two more tips that I missed. One is when you learn a new language, you can go into GPT or any AI and figure out, are there any loan words or cognates? So any words that in my language sound really similar in the language I'm learning, then you immediately have those words. So for example, if I say television in Japanese, that might be television. So I already have that word. Another one is I really recommend Reddit for finding good resources or apps in specifically the language that you're learning. Good luck.